Hello and welcome to Seminary Reacts, where we ask professors to react to Reddit questions and stories. Today I am joined by AMBS professor Jackie Wyse-Rhodes. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's lovely to be
Yeah,
here.
it's good to have you here.
Thanks.
So, can you say a little bit about what you teach, what knowledge you have about
Sure.
the Bible, and yeah.
Of course. I teach Hebrew Bible here at AMBS. Hebrew Bible is an ecumenical name for what Christians often call the Old Testament. And my areas of specialization include Second Temple, non-canonical Jewish literature, portrayals of the natural world in biblical and extra-biblical texts. I'm also interested in the book of Numbers, and I'm currently writing a commentary on it.
Awesome, awesome. And before we get into looking at these different Reddit posts, what is your experience with Reddit?
I love that you're asking me this. I have the Reddit app on my phone. I have limited experience. I never post on Reddit, but I consult Reddit when I am debating something like what brand of shoe is good for hiking. I've never actually done that, but
Okay,
I
yeah.
always feel like Redditors will have a good list of pros and cons if I'm considering a purchase or if I'm considering, one of my hobbies, my non-religion scholar hobbies is I really enjoy playing Zelda games on the Nintendo Switch, and so sometimes I consult Reddit when when I want to see how people are approaching a certain scene in my Zelda game. So I just think that
Cool.
Redditors have opinions about things that are helpful and they're very
Mhm.
passionate about them. And so I'm sort of a lurker on Reddit that like just wants to benefit from everyone else's generous knowledge. And so maybe someday
Yeah.
I will actually post on Reddit and share some of my knowledge, but to this point I haven't.
Cool,
Yeah.
cool. Alright, are you ready for our first
I am.
post?
Let's do it.
Okay, so this first one comes from the subreddit Explain It Like I'm 5. So it's people that are asking questions, kind of with the hope that people are responding respectfully and explaining things in a way that's really easy to understand.
Mhm.
So this post is the title is The Original Books That Comprise the Bible Were Written Many Centuries Ago.
Mhm.
How did the original copies survive so long? Wouldn't the originals be destroyed by natural disaster or deteriorate over time? How did the original copies survive from the elements long enough for copies to be made? Google is falling short of giving me a good answer.
Fantastic question. And I want to compliment this 5-year-old person. I know it's not literal. I
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
compliment this person on their question because the answer is that the originals did not survive. We don't have any originals of the texts that are in the Bible. What we do have are copies of copies of copies of copies, and accessing quote unquote the original is simply not possible, although scholars can hypothesize what earlier forms of texts would have looked like. Um, there's a whole field, and I guess I need to keep it like they're 5, okay? So,
Mhm.
because I was about to say there's an entire field of academic inquiry called textual criticism, but I don't think a 5-year-old would follow me on that. But there are scholars who in the past 100 years have been really passionate about trying to reconstruct the original book of Genesis, the original book of Jeremiah. Um, but nowadays, most scholars that I follow think that that's kind of a myth. That even trying to get at the original is trying to get at something so ancient and so ambiguous that it's an impossible task. Especially since there were different versions of these stories that were copied and told in different communities and preserved in different communities. And so there might have actually been 7 different stories about the prophet Jeremiah that are all equally ancient that were
Mm,
then eventually assembled together and included in the book of Jeremiah as we have it today. And so
mm,
the original just that doesn't honor what the Bible is and how it came together.
mm. So, for the copies that are typically used now, like how old are they and how are they preserved? How have they been preserved?
That's a good question. So our very oldest biblical texts are over 2,000 years old, and they come from most of them, not all, but most of them come from a site called Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered less than 100 years ago. And these scrolls contain a wide variety of texts. Many of them resemble our biblical texts or versions of texts that we now recognize as in the Bible. But there's also all sorts of other texts that were never canonized by anybody, but were really important to the community of people who lived near these caves. And scholars hypothesize that that was their library and their way of keeping these scrolls safe. So to answer your question, how did they survive 2,000 years? Well, they were in these clay jars in this very dry environment in these caves in the desert that were the ideal humidity and the ideal climate control that occurred naturally to preserve these texts. And even so, many of the Dead Sea Scrolls are fragmentary. So we have something like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is like the complete book of Isaiah and is huge and survived and is beautiful. Some other scrolls like the Temple Scroll are really big and quite I don't know if it's completely intact, but it's largely intact. But then we have lots of scrolls that were in pieces in these jars, right? So they didn't survive perfectly. And so in the mid 20th century, scholars were writing PhDs where their project would be to take the fragments of scroll from a certain jar and put them back together like jigsaw puzzles and try to figure out what text they originally held. And all of these scholarly decisions are still somewhat under debate today, depending on the condition of the fragments. And so it's a complicated question, right?
Yeah.
With the advent of book technology, right? Books, one of the reasons that, we might not think of books as technology, but they are, because think about a scroll, right? You roll it up, you only write on one side. If you put it in your backpack and hop on your camel and travel a long ways, like that scroll is pretty vulnerable, right? It could get crushed, it could get ripped, it could burn easily. It's also lightweight, and so that's good. But books, you can write on both sides of the parchment or papyrus. You can they're protected by these heavy covers. You can fit more text together, and they're more portable and they last longer, right? And so the advent of the book changed how long texts could last. But not everybody adopted it. Jewish communities continued to use scrolls, and even today, go to a synagogue on a Friday night, and the folks there are going to be reading from a Torah scroll as the traditional technology that is still handwritten by scribes who are trained to write by hand.
Yeah. Can you say more about the scribes and like I'm curious about like when we have these other copies, but how did they come to exist? I mean, if we don't have the quote unquote original copies, or whatever was written down first,
Yeah.
How did that process happen?
So being a scribe was like being a professional reader and writer, because literacy was quite rare in the ancient world, right? And so scribes were highly educated, trained in international bodies of literature, and they were trained to read and to write. And their job was to preserve texts that were important to the communities that they served. Some scribes were employed by royal courts, so like kings had scribes, but also there were scribes affiliated with different religious groups as well. And so they would scribes actually, those who were trained in scribal practices sometimes would read texts aloud, and they were trained to do so because paper didn't exist except in the form of parchment or papyrus or skins. It was very expensive, and so like there were no punctuation marks. There were no spaces between words. And so part of being a scribe is learning how to interpret this block of text that was, probably not even in most languages until you get to Greek later on in the but in languages before Greek, there weren't even capitals and lowercase letters. And so like scribes had to take these signs, these alphabets, and decide where the sentences began and ended, where the punctuation marks went, how to read them in a way that people could understand and remember. And so scribes were professional readers and writers. It was a specialized skill of the educated elite. However, scribes could also be enslaved persons. And so when I say they were educated elite, that indicates the fact that not very many people could read and write. Elite in that way, and that it was rare. But some scribes were enslaved and forced to do this kind of labor for their owners or the kings who enforced their labor. The book of Daniel may reflect this, as Daniel and his friends were conscripted into the ancient Babylonian court by Nebuchadnezzar, and they had to learn Babylonian arts and letters and learn how to be a scribe in that culture. And so that wasn't, I mean, Daniel and his friends didn't really have a choice, right? And so they were enslaved, but also trained, also educated. So it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
And to what extent is it a privilege to be a reader and a writer? But to what extent could it be non-voluntary?
Right. And I think it's interesting what you said about how books are like a form of technology. I mean, I think like what you said about all that scribes would have to go through with copying the text, and also just like what the texts were written on, and the fact that the way that information was communicated and written down and everything was so different than how we see it today. Because like, I mean, I feel like every celebrity has a book now because they can write it and distribute it.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, it's just, and if you want to find a Bible, like, it's so easy to do that.
Right.
But that's so different than the original context that we're using these texts and copying them.
And in fact, the idea of a Bible didn't exist 2,000 years ago.
Right.
Like there wasn't the collection of scriptures that Christians, Jews, other religious traditions that have like a specific set canon, which is, Muslims, name the religious tradition. Many of them have a specific set canon that you can't just willy-nilly add another book to, right? Because you like it. But 2,000 years ago, that process for that canon didn't exist. A Bible as a closed set of authoritative books didn't exist. Now, communities had scripture that they considered authoritative, that they read for all of the reasons we read scripture today, but people would disagree perhaps about which books were the most important. And it was a fluid category, right? It was a fluid category that I think the technology of the book actually allowed us to think of a closed canon, because you can have a set of a parchment that you bind, and then like, how do you add more to a book? It's already sewn together.
Right.
But if you've got a bunch of scrolls and they're all sitting in a jar in your back room, if you're lucky enough to own scrolls, you could easily take one out and add one in, right? And so yeah, so we have to remember too that the people who were writing the text we now consider the Bible didn't even have a conception of Bible as a closed canon, let alone many of them probably didn't even think, oh, I'm writing something that will be in someone's Bible someday, right?
Wow. Yeah. Huh. Yeah, that's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Are you ready for our next
Yeah, let's
question?
do it. Let's do it.
So our next question comes from the subreddit Christianity, and the question is, reading through the Old Testament is proving very hard. Anyone else feel this way? And the post says, I have read some of the Bible in my younger years, and I have had my Catholic confirmation, although I don't truly follow the Catholic Church anymore. I have recently begun trying to read the Bible in its entirety, and some of the Old Testament is proving very hard to read. And by that, I mean I find some of it irrelevant, such as building the tabernacle and all of the laws and rites and genealogy. I want to read more of the New Testament and teaching of Jesus, but I feel like I need to read all of it just because it's there. I feel like I need some help or want to know if anyone else has felt like this.
I want to compliment this person for not just giving up. I think a lot of people do give up when they get to, I don't know, maybe Leviticus chapter 16, they might give up when they or maybe even before that, when they get to the 15 chapters at the end of Exodus, where we're basically describing the tabernacle or the portable temple. One of the things that makes the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible so interesting to me is how it has these different assumptions about what's important and what's interesting than we do as modern people. And I think in order to read it well, we need to have help. We need to have companions. We need to have guides. Like, we need to not read it alone. And I would say reading from Genesis 1 through the end of, in Christian Bibles, the Old Testament ends with Malachi. In Jewish Bibles, it ends with Chronicles, because the books are in a different order. But if you read from Genesis to Malachi, Genesis to Chronicles, just from the beginning to the end, you can get stuck, right? You can get stuck if you don't have help. So I would tell this person, I would say, what Bible are you using, right? Are you using a Bible that's a pretty recent translation that was put together by an ecumenical group of scholars from a variety of backgrounds and that has footnotes that help explain things? I would recommend doing that. I would also say, I know this is going to sound really nerdy and maybe not all that interesting, but if you get a really good Old Testament textbook to read alongside your Bible, that's going to really help you. And it could help you read the Old Testament in a different order. So I highly recommend David Carr's Old Testament textbook, which the name is not coming to me right now, but I don't know if you have footnotes or show notes for your podcast.
Yeah.
But I can give you that to put in the show notes. But David Carr takes us through the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, by trying to have us read it in the order in which he thinks the texts were written, which is not the same order that they're presented to us, right? Because editors like put things in a different order that they thought made more sense, and they're very smart and they did a good job. But another way to read it is to start with some of the poetry that probably came earliest, and some of the narratives in Genesis that may have started out as like oral traditions told around maybe a campfire, right? And then were gradually written down later. And reading the Old Testament alongside the history of ancient Israel and Judah, and knowing when and why these different groups of texts were produced and what was going on in the wider world as they were being produced, it helps us understand why half of Leviticus is about how to offer animal sacrifices, which, especially if you're a vegetarian, can seem not only irrelevant, but really gross to read about. I'm not vegetarian, but still, like, there's a lot about viscera and blood and fat and like what to do with it all. And, it's a lot of technical terms for butchering animals. And I can totally see how that could feel irrelevant. What reading the Old Testament alongside these resources can do for you is to say, oh, it can give you some insight into 2,500 years ago, what would an ancient Israelite, why would this have been important to a scribe who was preserving this information? And then we can start to make connections, right? Like, I always tell my students, Amy, you've probably heard me say this, that there are two mistakes you can make when you're reading the Bible. And one is to say that the humans who are portrayed in the Bible, who wrote the stories in the Bible, they're just like me. They're humans just like me. They're not. We are in some ways strangers to them. This is a cross-cultural experience, right? Thousands of years across language, across culture, across technological assumptions, scientific discoveries. We are not exactly the same. But the other mistake is to say about the characters in the Bible and the people that wrote down these stories is to say, they're so different from us. We are so advanced and they are so primitive, right? Or they are like, I can't relate to anything about these ancient people. Well, that's not true either. They were still human beings with human emotions, in human relationships, seeking to live meaningful lives, right? With the humans that they loved, with the God that they worshipped. And these texts preserve that search for meaning. And so animal sacrifices in that ancient context functioned a lot like prayer does in religion today. You offer a sacrifice for lots of reasons, to say thank you, to say help, to say, yay, it's a special festival, right? And like we have special prayers at Christmas and Easter. And so we being Christians. And so I find it really helpful to make those connections in order to understand, even if you never really want to read the chapters on animal sacrifice a second time after you read them the first time.
Right.
Understanding why they were important to that person so long ago, or those people, or that group of people, I think can really increase our empathy and sense of connection with these ancient human beings that were trying to live meaningful lives just like we are.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, like, in my time in taking classes and in studying the Bible, recognizing the humans that are
Mhm.
talked about in this text, it's just been so interesting because, like, what you said about how, yeah, these are humans that are dealing with very human problems, and I think, like, in reading the biblical text and having that alongside learning about the historical context and about that culture, um, it gives a lot of appreciation for them because
Mhm.
I think, like, it helps to understand, like, "Oh, this is the context where they're living," and that kind of almost, in some ways, kind of helps to say like, "Oh, well, a modern example of this would be something
Yeah.
like this," and it really helps in saying like, "Wow, humans have been trying to figure this out
Yes.
for forever. This is
Uh-huh.
not it's not, some of these issues are not new issues." Like, I know, like, in so much of Genesis and all these family dynamics and
Right?
watching the way that different biblical characters operate within their families
Yeah.
and everything, it's like, yep, we're still dealing with that now, even though family dynamics were so different then,
Right.
but there's still a lot of, like, the core of it, there's still the same issues
Yeah.
that exist now.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Dysfunctional families existed 2,500 years ago as well.
Right,
Yes,
right.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, so there's so much benefit that I've had from learning more about the historical context and having, like, the way you said it, I really like the way you said it, is, like, the having a companion,
Mhm.
of, like, another text, of having something to be able to learn about the context behind what you're
Mhm.
reading. Yeah, yeah. And then one other thing that I wanted to point out again from what this person is saying, and I mean, I feel like the answer here is pretty obvious based on the fact that you've done so much with the Hebrew Bible, but this person mentions like that they want to read more of the New Testament and the
Mm.
teachings of Jesus, but they feel like they need to read all of it. And I know that I've seen sometimes a temptation from Christians to say that the Old Testament is not important. Clearly, because of your studies, I don't think you would believe that.
Right.
But what is your case for why reading the Old Testament is
Yeah.
important?
I love this question. Thank you for asking. It's one of my passions. Well, one reason is that what Christians call the Old Testament is the entire Bible of Judaism. So there's an entire religious community, many religious communities, many types and forms of Judaism today, for whom what we call the Old Testament is simply the Bible.
Mm,
And Christianity as a religious movement started out as a movement within Judaism, right? Jesus was Jewish, Paul was Jewish. The first Jesus followers were Jewish, and then the movement expanded to include non-Jewish people. But even as the movement expanded, there was still an affinity for the Jewish followers of Jesus. They were still Jewish, right? Just because they were including Gentiles in their worship of Jesus didn't mean they weren't Jewish anymore. And in
mhm,
fact, many of them continued to participate and go to synagogue and participate in Jewish practices. And so so that combined with the fact that what we call the Old Testament is what is analogous, not identical, but analogous to what Jesus called the law and the prophets. And Jesus quoted and interpreted his scripture, the law or Torah, or what Christians call Pentateuch, and the prophets, which is prophetic books, but also probably by prophets, Jesus meant the rest of scripture, right? Whatever
mhm,
he considered to be scripture.
mhm.
And so this is the Bible of the person that Christians say they follow, right? And so, of course, if it's important to Jesus, right, we need to
Yeah,
understand why.
yeah.
We need to understand how Jesus was living into his own religious identity and tradition, how it was inspiring him, how it informed him, and the fact that his whole ministry, in my opinion, was a ministry rooted in his own calling within this tradition of Hebrew prophets, right? Calling out for justice, calling out for people to follow to follow the Torah or the Pentateuch's instruction to love God and love neighbor with their whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. This was not something Jesus invented. Jesus was quoting his own scripture, his own tradition. And so the things that are important to Christians within the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus especially, rooted right back into Jesus' scripture and tradition. So I think we cannot understand the New Testament at all without understanding the scriptures that it grew out of. I mean, all the writers of the New Testament were quoting the Old Testament in Greek because they were writing in Greek, so they were quoting the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures called the Septuagint. And so I think when I see those little Bibles that just have the New Testament and Psalms, I always feel sad. Like, I'm happy for people to have access to that New Testament and Psalms. It's not, but I always feel sad because I feel like it's a truncation. It's an impoverishment of what is actually there as a resource. Yes, there are difficult texts in the Old Testament. There are also difficult texts in the New Testament, and I think Christians tend to forget that, right? There isn't the violence that troubles us in the Old Testament. Also, violence also occurs in the New Testament. The New Testament is just much shorter and doesn't have as many examples because it doesn't have as many words or pages. And it doesn't depict battle and war the way the Old Testament does. And so there's like a difference in genre, difference in culture and time. But I think we need to read the Bible as a whole. Read our two testaments in community with each other rather than pitting one against the other and saying that because we have the new, we don't have to worry so much about the old. I would love for Christians to embrace the Old Testament as an opportunity rather than a problem to solve. So that's something that I'm passionate about.
Yeah. And I think like being able to interpret in community and have maybe some other sources to help interpret. I know like again this person kind of said like well I just feel like I need to read all of it because it's there. Hopefully operating in a way of interpretation with others or with others' information can help with more of an appreciation rather than feeling like, oh, I have to do this because if it's important to Jesus, I guess I have to.
Right.
I guess it's supposed to be important to me too. But yeah, hopefully they're able to get some experience and be able to come to an appreciation of the Old Testament.
Yeah. And appreciating the Old Testament doesn't mean you have to like every verse, right? Just want to. I'm not trying to force people to like every verse. It's in my experience and in my opinion, the Bible invites us into dialogue, right? And some of that dialogue is, quite frankly, wrestling and even objection. And that is modeled for us in the Bible. Job objects when he suffers and he doesn't know why he's suffering and he doesn't get an answer and he demands that God show up. He uses courtroom language and sues God and says, God, I am suing you and I want you to show up and defend yourself. Why am I suffering? I don't deserve it, right? If biblical characters can be that assertive with God, I think we are also invited to be that assertive with our scripture and to say, why does it say this? I'm confused. This doesn't seem right to me. And that sort of honesty with God, with the scripture, I think is rewarded.
Yeah. I know one thing that Drew, who's one of the other professors here, he says a lot in class, like when we're interpreting texts that seem challenging, he always reminds us like God can handle it.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
God's a big God. If we're wrestling with this, if we're struggling with it, I mean God can handle that.
Absolutely.
He's not afraid of it. God's not afraid of it. Yeah.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. All right. Switching gears a little bit if you're ready for the next question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here.
Yeah.
So this one comes from the subreddit Christian, and the question is, how influential was Second Temple literature actually? And the post says, New Testament scholars reference Second Temple literature all the time as a source to tell us what the general Jewish community was thinking at the time of or leading up to Jesus. So, for example, referencing the Testament of Levi to indicate general expectation that the Messianic age would see an increase of people casting out demons. It seems likely that the Qumran community was generally aware of this literature, but do we have any evidence that larger Judaism was aware of this stuff and that it would have been a part of the overall milieu of that day.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. I love this person's curiosity. The answer is extremely influential, and
Yeah.
yes, as I said earlier, our categories of Bible versus non-Bible didn't exist, and
Right,
so
right.
Second Temple Jews and later early Jesus followers who later took the name Christians, they were reading a wide variety of literature. So what is Second Temple literature, right? What does that mean?
That's a good
Well, the
question.
New Testament itself is Second Temple literature. We just call it the New Testament because it's now in our Bible, right? At least some of it. I probably should qualify that. So it's Second Temple literature in that it was written. It was written in the wake of the destruction. Maybe like First Thessalonians. I don't know what. I'm not a New Testament professor, but from what I've read, First Thessalonians was written prior to the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE, maybe. And maybe some version of some of the material in the Gospels was circulating, right? But a lot of the New Testament was written in the wake of the destruction. And so some scholars might say, okay, that's not Second Temple literature anymore because the Second Temple didn't stand. But I think that literature written in the wake of the Second Temple's destruction, I think there's a good argument to be made that that still qualifies because it is still literature that's responding to this hugely horrific event in the life of Jews in Jerusalem and Judea.
Could you say more about like what that language means of Second Temple?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we hear about two temples in the Bible. The first temple was said to be built by Solomon, who was the third and final king of what is often called the United Monarchy. So the history of the ancient nation of Israel started out, I mean, before Israel existed as a kingdom, we get stories of judges and tribes and sort of a looser affiliation of people groups that that worshipped the same God, right? And sort of had and so we read about this pre-monarchy, more loosely affiliated local leadership situation that was more tribal. And then there's the monarchy that begins, and it's quite controversial. There are voices within the Bible that are pro-monarchy. Yes, a king is going to be a good thing. And there are really strong voices that are like, we shouldn't have a king. Like a king is going to enslave our people in order to build for building projects. A king will go to war. Our children will be killed in battle because of a king. A king is a bad idea. Look at the other nations around us with kings. The kings are not good news for them. We have God. We don't need a king. And so there's this like pro-king, anti-king conversation. But the monarchy does begin, and Saul, David, and Solomon are the first three kings of the United Monarchy. And then there is a division of the north, which maintains the name Israel, and the south, which takes the name of its largest tribe, Judah. And we get a story of two kingdoms simultaneously in the books of Samuel and Kings, later retold in the books of Chronicles. We get the story of these two kingdoms, both of which think that they're the real true kingdom that is in relationship with their God, right? And the southern kingdom the southern kingdom includes Jerusalem and has a really big Davidic kind of identity. Like David is from the King David is from the tribe of Judah, and it's very important. That's a very important identifying marker for them. So anyway, during the United Monarchy, Solomon builds the first temple. The temple is God's house. The palace is the king's house. The temple is God's house. God's house is where people go to offer sacrifices, to worship, to pray. The priests work there, right? And so this temple was, for the Southern Kingdom at least, the centralized place of worship that was destroyed by the Babylonians when the Southern Kingdom was destroyed in 586. And so that's the first temple, right? The first temple, there's no archaeological evidence, like there's no remains, like this is all, like our evidence for this is in literature, right? The memory of this. Now there was a time without a temple, a time where there was no more kingdom, no more temple. The northern kingdom had already been defeated by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. In 586, then this first temple was destroyed. And from 586 until 515, there was no temple. Now, when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, the Persian Emperor Cyrus invited all people, not just the Israelites and Judites, but all peoples to return to their homeland and resettle and rebuild their temples. And he was called actually a Messiah for this invitation. Messiah meaning anointed one, not Messiah in how Christians think of that word today, as but more of like Cyrus is saving us from our situation of being scattered and not having a temple. So people returned, but not everybody. A bunch of Jews stayed in Egypt. They had a temple in Alexandria they were happy with. They didn't return. People stayed scattered throughout the empire. Not everyone thought that they had to return, but there was a group who returned, and they rebuilt the temple, and that is the Second Temple. The Second Temple was rebuilt in 515 BCE, still standing during the time of Jesus, but it was destroyed by the Romans as a part of the conflict between the Jews of Jerusalem and the Romans in 70 CE. So Second Temple literature technically can be literature that was written during the Second Temple period, from 515 to 70, or I would argue in the wake of the temple's destruction for another at least 50 years, if not longer. Get me back on track, Amy.
So this person is asking, like, that was a good explanation of what Second Temple literature is, which I think was really good for us to have there as we're talking about this. So this person is asking if this literature was influential to Jesus's Jewish community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So some Second Temple literature, so some of the Hebrew scriptures are Second Temple literature, like the book of Daniel, for sure, was written during the Second Temple period, but also some of the prophets, some like a lot of the Bible as we have it today, even if it had been written earlier, was edited and finalized and collected together in the order and version that we have it today. It was first collected together in that way during the Second Temple period. But I think what this person might mean by Second Temple literature is Second Temple sources that are not in the Bible.
Probably,
and there's a ton of it. There's a ton of it, right? There are only 2 apocalypses that were canonized, but there are tons of apocalypses that still exist. And because they still exist, that means that they were important to people and people copied them, even though they weren't canonized, right? Apocalypses were super popular. There are tons of those. There are gospels, other than the 4 gospels that are in our New Testament. There are testaments. They mentioned the Testament of Levi. There are psalms outside of the 150 in the canonical book of Psalms. We've got all sorts of literature. This was a flourishing time for writing and for scribal activity, right? And so we've got the work of Josephus, we've got the work of Philo, these Jewish historians that are sometimes retelling biblical narratives and at other times writing down more recent Jewish history from their perspective. Second Temple literature was super influential. People knew about it, people talked about it, and we know this for one reason among many is that the book of Jude in the New Testament actually quotes the book of First Enoch, which is a non-canonical apocalyptic work, except for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which does include it in their canon. But for the rest of Judaism and Christianity, it was not a book that was canonized. But a book that was canonized quotes from this non-canonical book, right? So the writers of the Bible were reading more than what is now in the Bible. And so absolutely this was influential. Yeah. I often say to people, I mean, think about all of the influences on your view of, if you're religious, think about the influences on your view of God and where they come from. Many of them probably come from church or the Bible or a religious community or your family. But think about all of the books that are spiritual that you've read in your life that are not the Bible and ones that have resonated with you. Think about poetry you've read that reflects on sort of the cosmos and your place in it, right? In the same way, this wider body of literature was common knowledge. Now, by common knowledge, I don't mean that everybody knew every single thing, every single work that was out there. Different communities had different books that were important to them. So my answer is yes, super important. New Testament scholars are correct in what they are saying, in my opinion.
So if you were to, given how influential it was, if you were to recommend, if someone said, "I'm interested in reading some Second
Ooh,
Temple
yeah.
literature," what would you recommend for them to start with?
100% First Enoch,
I figured you would say that,
but
yeah.
especially the Book of the Watchers. So the Book
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
Watchers is as you know, because you've had
Mhm.
class with me.
Yes, I took an entire class with you that was just talking about Second Temple
You
literature,
did.
so
So
yeah.
you know this.
Yep, yep.
So if you want to add, Amy, something that you think they should read, you are qualified to do so.
Yeah, yeah.
The Book of the Watchers is the first booklet within First Enoch, what scholars call First Enoch, which is 5 books that are put into one that all have different origins, and some of them are older than others. The Book of the Watchers is one of the oldest of the books. It probably emerged in about the 3rd century BCE, or 300 years before the turn of the era, the birth of Christ, however you want to however you want to put that.
Mhm,
And the Book of the Watchers gives us a really interesting view into a different way to answer some really important questions. Like
mhm,
if you read the book of Genesis and you ask the question, where did evil come from? You might
mhm,
turn to Genesis 3 and say, oh, there's that story about the serpent and the fruit and the woman and the man in the garden, right? Because that's
mhm,
how we've been trained as Christian readers of and I mean, that's how we've been trained to think about the origins of evil, that
mhm,
story. But the book of Enoch, it gives a different answer to that question. And it
yeah,
takes this little fragment in Genesis 6 about divine beings or angels descending to earth, marrying human women, and having heroic children.
mhm,
It takes that little fragment just before the story of the global flood, and it expands it into 36 chapters, and it basically blames heavenly beings for introducing evil into the
mhm,
world. Now, humans were either willing or unwilling participants in this scheme. I'm not sure the human women that they married are necessarily depicted as having agency in that choice. But there were humans that were like, yes, teach me the technology of warfare. Teach me the
mhm,
technology of all this like secret heavenly knowledge that you're not supposed to share with me. Share that with me. And so humans participated, but it was the angels that made the decision to leave the heavens when they weren't supposed to,
mhm,
and to try to have human families, which they're not supposed to. They're angels. They don't need children. They live forever. Why do they need children?
mhm,
Right? And and this is what leads to the necessity of the global flood, because they've ruined the earth. It becomes completely like their children become monsters and giants and cannibals, and they like devour plants and animals and one another. And the earth is basically completely ruined, and God has to start over. And it's the angels' fault, right?
mhm.
Whereas in Genesis, humans are blamed for corrupting the earth with their violence. So, how would that change you as a human
Yeah,
if
yeah,
the story that you learned about where evil came from didn't wasn't only humans' fault, but it was
mhm,
bigger than that, right?
yeah,
That I think is super interesting because this was an influential book, that was even quoted in the New Testament, so people knew about it,
mhm,
um, and they also knew about the story of the man and the woman and the snake and the apple. So what does it
right,
mean that both of these stories were available to them? But
mhm,
today, we've sort of lost the story of Enoch. So I would say
right,
start with the Book
right.
of the Watchers. That's my advice.
I really like that, and I remember having those conversations in class about, like, if your perception of why evil exists and how it came to be is very different, like, how does that I mean, we talked about how it would make so many things different.
Mhm,
It would really change the way we think about, like, how we respond to evil now.
mhm.
So, yes, I would also recommend that. My other recommendation, which is more of just, like, I really enjoyed looking at this text,
Sure.
and I would encourage people just, like, for entertaining purposes, which I think First Enoch is entertaining too, but, um, I wrote a paper on the Book of Judith for your
Yes.
class, and I just found Judith to be a really interesting character.
Mhm,
I really love superheroes, and so I kind of saw Judith as a superhero herself,
mhm.
and so I was looking at the way that she was portrayed, especially as a woman as a superhero, And I mean, like, the entire book is definitely important to understanding the context of that text itself, but it is interesting that Judith, it's like halfway through the book that she finally shows up. But yeah, that would be my recommendation
Yeah,
if you want like a thriller
absolutely. And
for a text.
Judith is
Yeah.
actually in the
And
deuterocanonical books that are in Catholic Bibles. So
right,
if you're Roman
right.
Catholic, you might be like, Judith, I think I might
Yeah.
have seen that. And
Yeah.
Tobit is another good one
Mhm.
in the deuterocanonical books of Roman Catholic Bibles. I mean, you get
Yeah,
get magic fish and like a dog that appears and might, I don't know where does this dog come from? And it's this perhaps like miraculous angelic companion that guides the hero through the journey. Like there's angels in disguise, there's quests, there's a marriage that is dangerous because 7 husbands have died on the wedding night to this woman before, and is it going to happen again? Like Tobit is quite exciting as well.
Yeah, yeah. So, like, don't underestimate Second Temple literature.
That's right.
Because
That's right.
there's so much in it. Um, yeah, yeah, it's very entertaining. What we got to read for class, like, I wish that everyone was encouraged to be reading Second Temple literature, for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a dragon in the Greek version of Daniel, so
Yeah,
like
yeah,
check that
yeah.
out.
Ready for the next one?
Yes.
All right. This is going to be our final question. This one is coming from the subreddit Christianity, and the title of this one is Psalms. Does anyone understand Psalms? And the post says, Hi, I'm reading the Bible through 100% for the first time in my independent study, and I'm surprised, but Psalms are really losing me. I understand these passages that David are I understand these are passages that David wrote, but I feel like I'm missing something. They seem to be from the views of a person going from one extreme to another. First, he praises God, then is mad at God, then praises, then asks for mercy, and on and on and on. And I'm just confused to what is going on here. Also, what exactly is a psalm? Is it poetry or meant to be put to music? The psalms that I'm finding are very general and aren't really a story, but just confessions and accusations. Am I missing the point? What is your understanding of Psalms, and what are your thoughts?
I just want to say good job, person who wrote this, because you're actually already understanding the Psalms a lot better than you think you are.
Yeah, yeah.
Psalms, yes, they are poetry. Yes, they were originally set to music. So this is creative writing, but it's also prayer. And the fact that you are noticing moves from joy to sorrow, from exultation to lament, yes, you are reading correctly. Some psalms go from complete despair to joy and trust at the end. And how can someone do that in the course of 30 verses? Well, the answer is that this psalm probably was not written in the midst of the crisis, but probably written later in a moment of reflection, right? When a person had moved through this crisis and was sort of letting you in on something that had occurred to them or their community, and they were interpreting it in this poetic way, right? But you're on this whole journey with them. Some scholars think that these psalms were used liturgically, so in services of prayer and worship, and they were sung, and that maybe when there's some really, I don't know, you might feel like you're getting whiplash, moving from joy to sorrow or sorrow to joy, that those might have been moments when there was a pause, and the priest or the liturgist, like, did some ritual action, or there was something happening that actually would bridge that emotional gap that would make sense in its original context. That is kind of lost to us now that all we have are the words. Um, I want to say a word about David too. I think that one thing that confuses people is the fact that so many of the Psalms are attributed to David. It says a Psalm of David. What does that mean, right? It's not the same as when Amy Marshall writes a paper for class and it says by Amy Marshall, which means she wrote every word, and like I know that she wrote this in the past month and she is the author. These attributions are more vague, and it just basically says le David in Hebrew, and le just means of. And so it could mean like a psalm inspired by stories about David, but not written by David.
Mhm.
It could mean this psalm reminds me of David. It could mean that there was a tradition that this song was written by David in a certain situation. And there are a few psalms that specify this psalm was written by David during this situation. And then we can actually go back to the books earlier in the Bible that tell the stories of David and find that story. But did
Mm.
David actually write this, or is this simply a record of how this was interpreted by people? Right?
Mm.
And so this isn't actually a book that was even if you think every single psalm that says of David was written by David, even if that's your position, not every psalm has that subtitle. And so this isn't a book of prayers that were all written by one person over the course of one person's life.
Mhm.
Instead, this is a prayer book for a whole community, and it emerged gradually. Some of these psalms are probably super old. Some of them um, came hundreds of years later, but it's like a compendium. It's like a prayer book. Like if you go to a church that uses a prayer book, where did all those prayers come from? Who wrote them, right? They came
Mhm.
from many people in many circumstances. Some of them are hundreds of years old. Some of them may have been written last year. The Psalms are
Mm.
like that. But there are commonalities. There are frameworks um, that help you interpret these psalms, and that is to understand this word called genre, which basically means what kind of a psalm is it? Because there are psalms that are called laments, and there are psalms that are psalms of praise and thanksgiving, and there are psalms that are celebrating the king, royal psalms, and there are
Mm.
psalms that are celebrating wisdom. And so, like, there are different types of psalms that have different purposes, and getting to know that and then reading lament psalms like out of order side by side and seeing like, oh, this is how you lament something, right? You
Mhm.
like you like have a complaint that you bring to God. Something is wrong. You tell God
Yeah.
about it. Then you ask God for help. You tell God, this is how I need you to help me, right? And then sometimes you might move to a confession if you think you've done something wrong, but sometimes you've done nothing wrong and you're innocent, and you might be mad at God
Mm.
for allowing this to happen to you. And some of the laments make room for that. Most laments get to Thanksgiving at the end and an assurance of being heard, an assurance that God will intervene. But there's at least one lament that just ends in despair and doesn't even go there, right? Uh,
Just one?
I think there's just one, but there are some laments where the statement of trust is really, really brief and
Oh,
like
yeah.
almost perfunctory. And there
Uh-huh.
are some where it's really extensive. But there's
Mm.
one, I think it's Psalm 88, although I can double check that, where there's no assurance of being heard, there's no trust. It just
Mm.
ends in the depths of despair.
Wow.
Um, and so that is there. That is there for us. And
Mm.
we are invited to actually take these prayers and pray them as if they are our own,
Mhm.
um, which is an interesting way to read the book of Psalms if you are a religious person. What if this psalm was your prayer?
Hmm.
Does it reflect your experience? So,
Hmm.
so I would say a collection of all of those things to this wonderful human who is reading the book of Psalms and asking some very intelligent questions about it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think it really like, this person's just trying to read through the Book of Psalms, like, straight through. I wonder if maybe there's a better way for them to be going
Yeah,
through it that you might
sure.
have an opinion on? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, each psalm, when I'll say this, when I teach the book of Psalms, I teach it in two ways. First, I have people read, so the book of Psalms has 5 booklets, right? And many of them, and they are all organized in a certain way where sometimes the first psalm and the last psalm kind of echo each other. And so, first of all, I wouldn't sit down and try to read all 150. I would at the very least say, okay, I'm just going to read book 1. Now I'm just going to
Mhm.
read book 2. But even that is just one way of reading, and it's overwhelming. I have my students do it to try to understand this book as a whole and how it fits together as a collection. But then we move on, and during the rest of the semester, we focus on different types of psalms. Like one week,
Mm.
we will read 12 laments, and then we will really focus in on what these have in common. So this like requires you to do a little bit of research
Mhm.
and be like, okay,
Mhm.
which kinds of psalms are the same genre? And let's make a list, and then let's like maybe spend a week where every day you read one lament. And then you can kind of get a feel for laments. And then another week where every day you read a psalm of praise. And maybe there are, I don't know, half a dozen psalms that focus on wisdom. There are half a dozen psalms that focus on creation. So maybe by reading them in that way, they would feel a little more approachable and understandable. You could also just read one psalm a day for 150 days and just take each psalm as it comes and not try to read the whole book at once.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's interesting, like, there's this dynamic of, like, you can read it and kind of explore how the psalm is relating to your own experience and maybe the prayers that you have to God, but also I think, kind of like we talked about before, it's kind of seeing the humanity in the original writer and the way that this was used over time, and once again, going back to the idea that us as humans, we're battling the same things and feeling the same emotions and having the same thoughts towards God even in very vastly different contexts. So it's definitely a very valuable text.
I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Are there any other thoughts you have on Psalms that you wanna share?
I guess I do remember the person saying, "What is a psalm anyway?"
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And that's an excellent question because it is a very Bible-y word, right?
Mhm,
So I think a psalm, I think it's a prayer, it's a
mhm,
poem, and it's a song. And that's how I would answer that question. It's all three of
mhm.
those things.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
just wanted to say that to answer
Mhm.
that question more directly.
Yeah, yeah, to say what is when we're
Mhm,
talking about Psalms, what exactly is that?
mhm.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me here. I'm really glad that we had the chance to go through some of these questions. I think a lot of this information will be very valuable to a lot of people.
Thank you.
I think everyone needs to know about Second Temple literature.
I
So
agree.
I'm glad we covered that for a while.
Good.
I'm glad you talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's also one of my favorite pieces of information about the Bible. So there's a lot of really good stuff that we covered here. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for listening to Seminary Reacts. Please leave us a like, a positive review, and comment any questions or stories for us to react to. You can find Seminary Reacts on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. See you next time. Bye.